Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 9. With a woman's instinct to look her best when confronted by a tricky situation, Angela dressed carefully for dinner. She put on a long cream-coloured gown with a high waist and softly draped bodice. The dress clung to her hips and fell in graceful folds to her feet. It made her look very slender and youthful. The rich black coils of her hair she drew up onto the crown of her head, exposing the slim lines of her long neck, her small ears and wide forehead. A little eyeshadow gave mystery to her big dark eyes, but she used it sparingly, knowing that Clive disliked obvious makeup. She dared not apply any scent, but the lavender sacks which hung among her clothes gave a faint fragrance to her person. Involuntarily, she compared herself with that other dark-haired woman whose portrait hung in Celia's room. Feature by feature, Jasmine had no great advantage, but Angela lacked that sensual exotic aura which emanated from that pictured face. Jasmine epitomized sexual allure, but it seemed to Angela that the simplicity of a naive schoolgirl still hung to herself. Had she been given to poetic metaphor, she might have described them both as the pure serenity of a lily, contrasted with the flamboyance of a crimson peony. But such a flight of fancy would never occur to her. She went downstairs and surveyed the preparations for the meal. Maureen had stayed later than usual without demur, for she hoped to glean some gossip for distribution at home when her employers returned, but she was well aware of drama in the air. But did not know its cause. The mistress had been struck down as if by a hand of God. And according to Maureen's logic, such a visitation did not happen without provocation. But the gentle young Mrs. Stratton could have provided it seemed out of character. To Maureen's thinking, she was much too meek and mild, and if she had been in Angela's shoes, she would have told Mrs. Stratton senior long ago where she belonged, which was not at the head of the dining table, or behind the silver teapot in Clive's house. Quite unconscious of her handmaiden's silent championship, Angela expressed her approval, and hoped the men would not be so late that Maureen's coq au vin, made under her supervision, would not be spoilt, but at the right time only Ralph appeared. "Ma's better," he announced. "She's conscious, but she hasn't spoken yet. The doctor thinks she may do soon." "Oh, I'm so glad," Angela exclaimed with genuine relief. "But where's Clive?" "He's staying a little longer. She seems to want him to hold her hand. He'll be along later." Angela thought Clive was overdoing the devoted son, for he was not Celia's son, and if she was out of danger he might have come home. But perhaps he felt guilty because the stroke had been caused by his wife's disclosure, and was striving to make amends, a thought that made Angela wince. She also suspected that Celia was endeavouring to keep him from her, and using her helplessness to chain him to her bedside. Even in her extremity, her possessiveness was paramount. Meanwhile, Ralph was appraising her elegant appearance. "Dolled up, aren't you, love?" he said appreciatively. "Does me good to see something truly feminine after all those stretched uniforms, but I don't flatter myself you've done it for my benefit." "Oh, I like to make myself look nice in the evening," Angela told him, hoping Clive would be similarly impressed. A doubt struck her. "But perhaps I shouldn't have changed. Does it seem heartless?" "Oh, for Lord's sake, we aren't in mourning yet," Ralph exclaimed. "Well, if Clive isn't coming, we'd better go and eat," Angela suggested, only half reassured. Ralph did justice to the coq au vin, but Angela merely picked at her portion, for the ordeal of meeting Clive still hung over her. She arranged with Maureen to put something to keep warm for him in the cool oven, one of the features of the Argus stove. Then Ralph announced that he was going for a ride. "Want to get the smell of disinfectant out of my nose," he explained. "Why don't you come along? Blow the cobwebs away." She declined this invitation, for to ride she would have to change, and wanted to be there when Clive arrived. I wouldn't like him to come back to an empty house," she explained. "He'll be in a filthy mood," Ralph warned her. Angela's heart sank. Ralph was telling her what to expect. For a moment she wavered. It would be pleasant to get out and away on this beautiful sunlit evening and postpone the inevitable showdown, but it would only be postponing it. Better to get it over and done with. He's had a trying day," she pointed out to excuse her husband. "And you, as a good little wife, are hoping to provide soothing syrup," Ralph jibed. "I wish you luck, my angel." He went off whistling to change before going to the stables. His mother's illness did not seem to weigh upon his spirits, but always an optimist, he was already convinced of her complete recovery, and he too had had a trying day. Angela stood at the window to watch him ride away, a gay and gallant figure in boots, breeches and sweater on a skittish chestnut horse. Disdaining a hat, the speed of his going blew his black hair in disorder about his brown face, giving him a rakish air. Actually, he was more her contemporary than Clive, but she felt definitely elder sisterly towards him. She wished Clive had more of his half-brother's sanguine temperament, but then he would not be Clive, whose faults as much as his virtues constituted the make-up of the man she loved. Feeling restless and apprehensive, she strolled out into the garden, after putting a fleecy stole over her shoulders, for though it had been a warm day, it still turned chilly at night. The lovely evening light lay over the profusion of spring blossoms and flowering trees, which made May the most beautiful of all the months. The first of the roses were in bud, showing colour, and a trellis covered with honeysuckle filled the air with fragrance. For Angela it had been a long spring, starting with the melting of the snows in Nuristan, which seemed an eon ago, followed by her marriage and the ill-starred expedition to Bamiyan. It was a long way from the colossal figure of Buddha to this English garden, and it seemed impossible. It could only have been a few weeks since she had stared at its scarred face, and her memory had returned to her. The calm beauty all around her soothed her taut nerves. She crossed the lawn and went down the steps through the rockery into the rose garden beyond. A bat flitted across the rose and amber sky. Somewhere in the trees an owl hooted. Angela sat down on a rustic bench, and it was there that Clive found her when at last he returned. She looked enticing enough to disarm any irate husband, the soft folds of her dress falling about her, the stole slipping from her shoulders to display arms, neck, and delicate profile, old ivory and the last of the daylight against the dark background of the shrubbery. But Clive was in no mood to be enticed. He came striding down from the lawn above with obvious purpose. He still wore the slacks and pullover of breakfast time, having had no opportunity to change, and his face was pale and drawn with lines of weariness and anxiety, his mouth set in a grim line. Angela, glancing nervously towards him as he approached, saw that his eyes were very cold. Grey eyes, she thought with a shiver, could appear glacial. She stood up and asked timidly, "Would you like your dinner, Clive? It's being kept warm for you." "Later." He dismissed food with a wave of his hand. "Ralph says Mrs. Stratton is better," Angela went on. "I'm so glad." "She'll live," he told her succinctly, "but no thanks to you." His expression became accusatory. "Didn't I tell you not to mention the name of Sullivan in her presence?" "You did, but you didn't tell me why," she said reproachfully. "You should have done, for it was bound to come out sooner or later, and I don't like evasion and pretense. I'd no idea what you all believed about my father, which I'm sure isn't true, until it all came out at breakfast. I too had a shock, Clive." Her dark eyes were full of appeal, but his did not soften. "Not half the shock it gave me at Bamiyan when I discovered I'd married Edmund Sullivan's daughter," he returned. "Of all the women in the world, you're the one who, out of common decency, I should have avoided." He was as prejudiced as his stepmother, and Angela's drooping spirits flared up at the injustice of his pronouncement. "Why?" she demanded fiercely. "Has the libel you've fastened upon my father made me into a pariah? Is that what's become of us? You're being unreasonable, Clive." "I don't think so. I've been very forbearing." "By keeping away from me? I'm to be perpetually deprived of my husband because I happen to have been born a Sullivan?" "No, not because of that," he said to her surprise. "I asked you to be patient, you'll remember." "I see no need for patience," she returned stormily. "Nor can there be any other reason for your withdrawal. I'd appreciate more candour from you, Clive, instead of these continual evasions. If you'd told me on that night when I came to you what you had against me, instead of rambling on about the sorrows of Jasmine, what happened this morning would have been avoided." "I couldn't," he said so gently that she was astonished. "You were so certain of your father's integrity. It would have been cruel to enlighten you." "And are you so certain you're not mistaken?" she demanded. "I am." His confident tone roused her ire. He permitted no shadow of doubt, and with her whole soul she rejected the aspersion cast upon her father's honour. "Then let me tell you you're quite wrong," she cried, her voice quivering. "Daddy couldn't have had an affair with Jasmine." "You were an only child. It would be easy to deceive you," he told her, adding with pity and contempt, "Poor Angela." He turned aside and picked a white rosebud, staring at its unfolding petals absently. "I don't want your pity," she fumed. "That's all you've ever given me, isn't it? Pity." He seemed about to speak, checked himself, and returned to his contemplation of the rosebud. Angela gazed yearningly at his bent head, half averted from her. She wanted to put her arms around him, beg him to let her comfort him, soothe him, for was it not her place to do so? She was still his wife, and once he had desired her. She made a movement towards her, and as if sensing her purpose, he drew back. Only a yard at most, but it showed her how completely he was alienated from her. "What happens now?" she asked drearily. "I suppose you'll never forgive me for what happened this morning." "I hope I'm not so vindictive," he said with a touch of hauteur. He paused, glanced at her, and then went on almost apologetically. "I'm very fond of Celia, Angela, and I owe her a lot. I'd lost my own mother, remember, and she made no difference between me and her own child. I hate to see her hurt. She's had a lot of sorrow. She's lost 2 husbands as well as her adored daughter." "I appreciate all that, but it's no reason why she should be so beastly to me," Angela told him with more warmth and wisdom. Clive threw her a quick, steely glance. "I hadn't noticed she was being beastly to you. It seemed to me that she made you very welcome." The blind obtuseness of the male, Celia's innuendos and deliberate malice had passed him by. Angela choked back angry words. How could he have failed to notice that she had been continually humiliated by comparisons with Jasmine to her disadvantage? But perhaps he had been making the same comparisons himself and found her lacking. The thought was painful, though by no means a new one. Gathering dignity around her with her stole, she drew herself up and said frigidly, "Since you so obviously prefer your stepmother to me, there's no need to continue with this farce of a marriage any longer." He stared at her in astonishment, his fingers worrying the frail flower he held. "What on earth do you mean by that?" "That I'm tired of being treated like a cipher. I've no place here at Abbotswood, where I'm only an unwanted guest." "You can take over the reins at any time," he pointed out. "Mother was only deputizing for you until you'd found your feet." But that was not Angela's real grievance. With Celia ill, she would be expected to run the house in any case, but to be merely Clive's housekeeper was no solace for being banished from his arms. Wanting to pierce his indifference, drive him into some show of feeling, she announced acidly, you'd find me inadequate, I'm sure, and now I've means of my own I need impose no longer upon your generosity and your pity. I only accepted them because I had no option." He dropped the maltreated rosebud and came towards her, his hands clamping down upon her shoulders like a vice. "You're saying you only married me because you were destitute?" His voice was dangerously quiet, but the glint in his eyes betrayed that she had reached him at last. "I wouldn't be the first woman to marry for a meal ticket," she told him. "I'd never have believed you could be so mercenary." He stared down into her defiant dark eyes. "I thought you were still half a child, a sweet submissive creature without guile, whose naive simplicity had not yet been corrupted." This description galled her. He was making her sound like a credulous teenager, all goo-eyed for his favours, and at the back of her mind was the image of Jasmine, the epitome of sophisticated allurement. "It's always easy to deceive a man, particularly when one wants something," she said airily. "Is that so?" he inquired slowly. "So you took me for a sucker. I remember now, you suggested a marriage without consummation. Were you trying to evade full payment?" She made a small sound of dissent, but he went on without heeding her. "You were also complacent about any future expeditions which would take me far away from you. You were insistent I shouldn't consider myself tied. All very charming, and it only occurs to me now that that was an unnatural attitude for a new bride to take." Just what Ralph had implied, but how could Clive so misunderstand her? At the time, he had seemed pleased by her compliance, but now he was deliberately misinterpreting her motives. "You've got it all wrong," she said breathlessly, for his fingers were digging relentlessly into her shoulder, and though his touch was so ungentle, tremors were running down her spine, but not for worlds would she betray how he was affecting her. "It was because I wanted you." "Sounded like it, didn't it?" he interrupted. "You didn't want me, Angela. You just admitted that you were only after what I could give you." "So what?" she asked angrily. She had been about to say that she had wanted him because she loved him, but his stupidity enraged her. Didn't he know? Couldn't he see? Apparently not, for he went on bitterly, having accepted her rash words as the truth. "Like the rest of your sex, your innocent airs conceal the little go-getter you really are. Now you've come into money, you're proposing to leave me, since I've served my turn. Isn't that what you said?" As she again tried to interrupt. But it's a pity that you couldn't have controlled that indiscreet tongue of yours before you departed. Now you're leaving havoc behind you, but perhaps you'd have created worse havoc if you'd stayed, so maybe Abbotswood will be well rid of you, and we can have some peace." She had made no allowance for the fact that he was tired and overstrained after a long day of anxiety at the hospital, and since she was responsible for the crisis, he was in no mood to be conciliatory. She could have reminded him that when she had sought him on that memorable night, he had repelled her with a vague promise that the situation would right itself in time, an attempt to stall her. He had never professed to return the love he seemed to expect from her, and ever since he had learned her identity, he had withdrawn from her. He was far more to blame than she was for their estrangement, and now he was twisting all her words to show her in a reprehensible light. She would have been wiser to say no more until he was in a better mood, but her own pain and resentment were welling up in a wild desire to hit back. Searching for words to hurt, she said scornfully, "Perhaps you believe that wives, like children, should only speak when they're spoken to. You've always expressed contempt for women. You condescended to marry me only because you thought I was a poor little waif who would be utterly subservient to you, for you're a despot at heart, Clive. You'd like me to approach you on bended knee, wouldn't you, and address you as presence, like you said the Afghan women do. You're only sorry you can't shut me up in Purther, which is where you'd said all women should be kept." "You're talking rubbish," he said through his teeth.
"I'm only quoting your own words back to you," she said sweetly, and he reddened uncomfortably. Pleased with this sign of discomfort, she went on recklessly. "You're furious with me because I dared to assert myself. Is it a sin to want to acknowledge one's parentage?"
"You chose the wrong time and company." He lifted his head arrogantly. "I suppose it's too much to expect you to respect your husband's wishes, much less obey him."
"I'm not a harem slave," she flashed. "You've no right to insist that I conceal my name as if it was something to be ashamed of."
She saw him frown and rushed on.
"I forgot you think it is, but I'm not with you there. Take your hands off me. You're hurting me. If this is how you treated Jasmine, I'm not surprised that she bolted."
He almost threw her away from him.
"For God's sake, leave her out of it."
"How can I, when I'm confronted by her at every turn? You can't forget her, can you, Clive? You're as obsessed by her as your stepmother is."
"Shut up!"
he bade her curtly.
"I won't shut up. All the doubts and fears she had been suffering since coming to England boiled up and overflowed. Nor will I stay here and share you with her. Now I'm independent, I can snap my fingers at you, your stepmother, and Jasmine too. Clive!" She cried his name in an onrush of fright and apprehension, for he had swept her up into a merciless hold, and his face was contorted with fury. She had never seen him really lose his temper before, and the violence of his rage appalled her.
"Snap your fingers, will you, my girl?" he snarled. "I'll teach you who's master here and where your loyalty belongs. Kindness and forbearance are useless with women. This is all they want and understand."
There was no love or tenderness in his punishing kisses. Angela lay helpless in his arms, where that, his control having snapped, he was motivated only by a desire to subdue and dominate her, to show her that she might have tried to flout him. In the end she was powerless before his masculine strength. He turned towards the shrubbery, and guessing his intent, she whispered urgently, "No, not here, not now. Someone might come."
"Who cares? This is my ground. You're my wife,"
he muttered thickly. He was in the grip of primitive desire, seeking release from the tensions of the day and the solace of his woman. Angela's reluctance melted away. She had longed her husband's embraces, and now he was about to take her again. Her body went limp, and excitement set her pulses hammering. The golden glow had vanished from the sky, submerged in the purple haze of the falling dusk, for the sun had gone down. The fragrance of flowers scented the still air, and from their treetop the doves were softly calling, mate to mate. Angela's hair, which was never too secure, fell from its bonds to drape them both. "It's Clive! Oh, my God!" as Clive pushed his way into the bushes. A bramble caught at her bare arm, drawing blood as their passage wrenched it away. She did not feel it. Her whole being was submerged in his. From the lawn above them, Maureen called, "Mr. Stratton! Mr. Stratton! Dr. Murray's on the phone!" He stopped and his arms went slack. Angela could feel the apprehension in him. He dropped her unceremoniously among the rosemary, laurel, and other bushes, so abruptly that she nearly fell. "I'm coming!" He left her then.
leaping up the steps through the rockery and running across the lawn, his passion doused by the chill of fear. The aromatic scent of rosemary was sharp in Angela's nostrils as she made her way out of the shrubbery, her pretty dress smeared, its bodice torn by Clive's impatient fingers. Rosemary for remembrance. Celia was inevitably connected with Jasmine in Clive's mind, and Jasmine had again defeated her supplanter. Angela stood in the rose garden, twisting up her hair, feeling lonely and desolate. She picked up her stole, which had fallen when Clive had lifted her, and put it up about her shoulders, aware that she was very cold. She had hoped desperately the doctor had not rung up to say Celia was sinking, for Clive would consider she was little short of a murderess if she died. At her feet, gleaming palely in the dusk, was a rosebud Clive had thrown away, hating to see a flower discarded. She raised it in her fingers, but it was too crushed and broken to be resuscitated. She dropped it, thinking it was symbolic of the way he had trampled on her heart. Idly he had plucked the bud to give him a moment's pleasure, and had cast it aside when it had ceased to interest him. Wearily she went back towards the house, dreading to hear the news that might await her there. Mrs. Stratton, however, was better, and Dr. Murray, an old family friend, had made a late-night call at the hospital and had rung Clive to tell him that she had spoken his name and was now sleeping naturally. Ralph came in while Clive was eating a belated meal to arrange their plans for the following day. Angela sat at a little distance from them, huddled in her stole. She had brought Clive's food in to him, and he thanked her perfunctorily, avoiding her eyes. She sensed that he was ashamed of his violence in the garden, but was too incensed against her to apologize. Ralph glanced at her from time to time, noticing with concern her pale face and shadowed eyes. He brought her a glass of wine and insisted she drank it. Angela caught Clive's sardonic smile and wondered if he thought he was trying to subjugate his half-brother now. Ralph said kindly, "Better go to bed, Angel. You look worn out." "I think I will." She stood up and looked appealingly at Clive, but he turned his head away.
"Good night,"
he said gruffly. So she was not to be forgiven. She had half hoped he would come up with her to complete what had been interrupted in the garden, but it was obvious all passion was dead in him now. And he had reverted to his previous mood of censure. Wearily she climbed the stairs and went into her own room. Her relations with her husband seemed to be hopelessly wrecked, and her best course was to go away and start a new life. But before she closed this chapter of her stormy existence, there was still a task she had to perform. Whether if she carried it out successfully it would make any difference she did not know, but she was determined to try. She must vindicate her father. Angela decided to go up to London next day. She did not see Clive, he had gone out early, but Ralph was there, and after giving her instructions to Maureen, who seemed quite pleased to be left in charge, she told him she had business to attend to, and would spend the night at a hotel. "In connection with your inheritance, I suppose?" He looked at her awkwardly. "Don't take all this too much to heart. Mother's never been quite sane about Jassy, and she's going to recover. Clive will never forgive me." "Of course he will. It wasn't your fault. How could you have known your name was like a red rag to a bull? Besides, she isn't his mother, and if I can exonerate you, he must." As Angela still looked doubtful, he smiled and patted her shoulder. "I dare say it's not a bad idea to go away for a few days. Give him time to get his priorities right." "Of which I'm not one," she thought, and said aloud, "Just what occurred to me. I'll miss you, Angel, so don't stop away too long." Balm to her sore heart. Why could not Clive be as magnanimous? But Clive had been married to Jasmine, and Ralph, from what he had said, had not liked his half-sister. So he would feel no resentment against her lover and her lover's daughter. But Angela was out to prove that Edmund Sullivan had never been that. Angela went to see Mrs. Hampson. Could he, she inquired, give her any information about Edmund Sullivan's expedition to Greece in 19... So it says, 19... ... Question mark. Did he know anyone who had accompanied her father, who could tell her the names of the personnel engaged? For she wanted to discover if Jasmine Stratton had been among their number. Mr. Hampson was perplexed and a little suspicious. It was a long time ago, and he could remember no details, but if she really needed some information, she could look up Jack Forrest.
He was a very old friend of your father's, and I believe he sponsored that dig. He went with them, and I could tell you anything you want to know. I'll get my secretary to ring and find out if he's in town. He lives in Hampstead."
Jack Forrest was, and was surprised and delighted to learn that Angela had survived the crash. He would welcome a visit from her at any time. Angela taxied out to Hampstead that same afternoon in a mood of mingled triumph and trepidation. If anyone could tell her the truth, it would be this Mr. Forrest. But would he? If Edmund Sullivan had been having an affair, would he disclose it to his daughter? Or was it not more likely he would try to cover up for him? Somehow she must convince him that the knowledge was essential to her, and at least he would confirm whether or not Jasmine had been on that expedition. There was no doubt about Jack Forrest's passion for antiquity. Every article in his house breathed history, from the ancient armour in the hall, swords, dueling pistols and cutlasses adorning its walls, to the Greek and Egyptian ornaments in his sitting room. Angela had met him several times during her school days, and had thought he looked like a mummy himself, with his brown, wizened face redeemed from ugliness by the intelligent dark eyes. He had never married. The appearance of the room into which she was shown by his houseman was a little startling. There was a mummy case in one corner, with a gilded mask, and a statue of a nymph in another. There were cases of statuettes of the sort found in Egyptian tombs and Greek vases on carved tables, but the chairs and settee were Victorian, except for several wooden ones which she thought must be Sheraton. Mr. Forrest did not seem to mind mixing his periods. The only consistency about the room was that nothing was modern. Even the curtains looked like tapestry, and the floor covering was a Persian carpet. Glancing at the undoubtedly valuable antiques, Angela remembered Clive's indictment. Some of the articles might have been smuggled into the country, for their counterparts were only to be found in museums. A large white cat was ensconced in the best chair, which gave her one disdainful glance, then went back to sleep again. She had waited some time, and when Jack Forrest did appear, he had obviously not spent the time tidying himself. His old velvet jacket was dusty with cigarette ash, his trousers were baggy, and he wore a little black skull cap on his mane of untidy silvery hair. He begged her to excuse his appearance. He had not expected her to arrive so soon.
"I was in the middle of unpacking a case of ancient papyrus that has been sent to me to decipher. I am, you know, an expert on hieroglyphics. They are of absorbing interest, and I forgot the time."
Angela apologized for disturbing him.
"Not at all, my dear," he said kindly. "I'm honoured that a young and attractive woman can spare a moment to visit an old fogey like me. You must have some tea." He pressed a bell. "I was shocked to hear of poor Eddie's death when was it, 6-8 months ago? But rejoice that you escaped. You've grown into a very beautiful woman, Anne. You remind me of the head of Queen Nefertiti. You know it, of course. And so smart," he went on, eyeing her becoming two-piece. "Amazing how time flies. It seems only yesterday that you wore a ponytail and a gym slip. Oh, I was so delighted when Hampson told me you were alive. It's so sad when young lives are cut short."
Tea was brought in to them by the houseman, a Japanese, in a Queen Anne silver teapot. There were cucumber sandwiches and a rich plum cake.
"I hope it's to your liking, ma'am," he said. "The master never noted—"
"Oh,
I hope it's to your liking, ma'am," he said. "The master never notices what he eats."
Angela assured him that it all looked delicious.
"I hope it's to your liking, ma'am. The master never notices what he eats."
Whichever. Angela assured him that it all looked delicious. It was some time before she could bring her host to the subject about which she had come to inquire. She told him about her marriage, and watched eagerly to see if the name Stratton...
Excuse me.
Apparently it did not. Stratton rang a bell. Apparently it did not. Finally she mentioned the expedition to Greece and the date.
"Ah, yes, we were in search of Argive tombs. They think they found the graves of Agamemnon and Menelaus, but they're not verified. For a long time they were thought to be mythical characters, but so was Troy until Schliemann discovered it by following the directions in the Iliad. There's still a vast amount of research to be done on those sites." "I'm sure there is." She couldn't care less. "Mr. Forrest."
Excuse me," she said earnestly.
"This is important to me. Can you recollect who went on that trip with you? Were there any women? To be sure there were, though I don't consider it women's work. They don't make good archaeologists, because women are rarely dedicated to one subject, and when they do go on digs, too often they have an ulterior motive, and we had an unfortunate example of that on that expedition. Yes, Angela prompted breathlessly as he paused. Do you remember who she was? I haven't had much to do with women, but I know that one was a wrong 'un the moment she entered the aircraft. She's got poor old Eddie twisted round her little finger. Angela's heart sank at this pronouncement. It appeared that she had attended a course of lectures he gave on Greece during the winter, which she had declared had aroused in her an intense interest in Grecian monuments. Also, she had contributed handsomely towards our funds, so I suppose he felt bound to take her. Caused trouble right from the start by turning up at the last moment. Eddie thought she wasn't coming and hadn't made a reservation for her. I don't remember many of the others, but I couldn't forget her. Wild, tempestuous sort of creature, and about as genuine interested in digging as that cat. Beautiful, isn't she? The cat, I mean, the only female I've ever lived with. He chuckled at what he considered a risque joke. Sleeps on my bed at night. Oh, I should have done in more camp. This girl, Angela recalled him to the point. Do you remember her name? He wrinkled his brow. Lawson, I think it was. And Angela felt relieved until she recalled that Jasmine's maiden name would not be Stratton, and she had never heard it mentioned. Nor were Jack Forrest's next words reassuring. Of course it was old Eddie she was after, he told her. Your father was a good-looking fellow, my dear, but he didn't realise what she was up to. However, that didn't stop her from playing the field. She created havoc among the team, and what was worse, she became involved with our Greek helpers. A big expedition employs a lot of native labour, as I expect you know, to do the heavy work, and some of those Greeks were very handsome. Greeks are passionate and jealous, and when they started knifing each other over her favours, Eddie said she must go home. He paused and looked at Angela doubtfully. It isn't a very pretty story for a young lady to hear. Tell me one thing. Can you remember the girl's Christian name? He looked perplexed. I know it was something outlandish. I've no use for fancy names myself. My mother was called Mary, and you're Anne. Yes, she was torturing the strap of her handbag in her suspense. Sensible names, I'm sure. Was hers Jasmine? He looked blank, and then suddenly his face cleared. Jassie! That's what they called her. I remember now, because I thought at first it was Jessie. Brassy would have been more appropriate. Please, Mr. Forrest, tell me everything, Angela besought him. I know this girl's relatives, and they're slandering my father, so I've come to you to learn the truth. What, after all this while? But if they're anything like her, I'm not surprised. Venomous she was. Well, Eddie had her on the carpet, and he asked me to be present in the tent. He'd that much sense, and a good thing I was there too. She wept and raved, declaring that she adored him. She'd only come because of him. She'd left her husband because of him. The first we'd heard of her husband, by the way. And he was so cold, so unresponsive, she'd been forced to console herself with others who appreciated her more. Perhaps she really did care for him, Angela said, doubtfully, feeling a sudden sympathy for Jasmine. She, too, knew the pain of love unrequited. Not her. His attraction for her was his indifference. If he'd had the bad taste to flirt with her, she'd soon have tired with him. But you know your father, he was dedicated to his work, and to dally with a woman when he was on a dig would have seemed sacrilege to him. I don't think he ever looked at a woman other than your mother. I'm sure he didn't, Angela exclaimed, delighted to have her faith confirmed. But what had happened then? He got rid of her in the end by telling her she was married, and her passport showed... By telling her if she was married and her passport showed her as single, he'd report her to the authorities, who might put her in prison. She went home the next day vowing she'd kill herself, and that was that. Falteringly, Angela told him of Jasmine's end and the suspicion attached to it. Well, it wasn't on Eddie's account, Mr. Forrest said emphatically. More like it was the Greek boy Nico. Meads she misbehaved with. She tried to get him to marry her before she left, but Greek men don't marry. Naughty girls. Besides, By her own admission, she wasn't free. The light of battle came into the bright eyes, which were so young in his old face. If anyone's casting aspersions on Eddie's character, you refer him to me, my girl. I'll soon scotch him. Mission accomplished, Angela said aloud when she finally managed to extract herself from Jack Forrest and was on her way back to the hotel. Her faith in her father had been justified, and she could tell Clive that he had been under a misapprehension all these years, and he had no cause to regret having married Edmund Sullivan's daughter. But beyond the satisfaction of being proved right, where would that get her? Clive did not love her. If he did, it would not have mattered to him what her father had done. He was still obsessed by Jasmine's memory, so that it would be cruel to tell him all she had learned that afternoon, from which it was only too obvious Jasmine had been a thoroughly bad lot. It was one thing for Clive to believe she had left him because she could not resist a grand passion for a man who had enticed her away from him, quite another to discover that she had, as Mr. Forrest put it, played the field. Now that her husband blamed her for causing his stepmother's stroke, she was irretrievably alienated from him, so that it seemed her only course was to leave him, and she would leave him with his illusions intact. He had refused to destroy hers when he had thought she was deluded about her father, and she could equal him in generosity. But hadn't she already left him when she booked her room at the hotel? Hadn't she known then that she would never go back? She had no place in that stricken household where Jasmine reigned supreme. Only Ralph had any regard for her, and he would be coming to London soon. Clive's real wife, his mate, was the ghost of the girl he had never ceased to regret. She would write to him and tell him of her decision, which would not be wholly unexpected after that scene in the garden. How easily he had been convinced that she had only married him out of expediency. He could not believe anything good of a Sullivan. She would not undeceive him about that either, since he did not want her love. Everything he had done had been motivated by Jasmine. His exile in Nuristan was due to her. Even the consummation of their marriage had been influenced by her. She had cheated him, he had said, so he meant to have fulfillment from his second wife. Had he ever done anything that did not have its roots in his passion for Jasmine? Recalling the beautiful, wilful face, Angela realized how foolish she had been to ever dream she could fight her influence. The marvel was that Edmund Stratton had been able to resist her, but thank God he had. Edmund Stratton? Edmund Sullivan? That's what it says. Angela went to bed, and since her mind was made up, slept soundly, only to have her decision revoked next morning, for she was horribly sick, and wondering what she could have eaten to upset her so much, a sudden suspicion shot into her mind, and she began to calculate dates. She would have to go back to Abbotsford, for it was possible that she was going to bear Clive's child.